Hi, everyone. We've set up this Being an Engineer podcast as an industry knowledge repository, if you will. We hope it'll be a tool where engineers can learn about and connect with other companies, technologies, people, resources, and opportunities. So make some connections and enjoy the show.
I pick up the phone and hello, yeah, this is Elon Musk. And I'm like, hi. And then so I literally have to start interviewing while my wife and my friend are in the car and I'm trying to navigate through the rain.
Hello and welcome to the Being an Engineer podcast. Today we're speaking with Michael Kubba, who is an experienced and hands-on product development leader and has led hardware, systems, manufacturing, and operations teams across multiple industries, including wearables, robotics, and consumer electronics. Michael has a passion for user-centric design and a focus on taking products from concept to production. A few companies for which Michael has worked include Apple, Google, and Tesla, obviously some of the heavy hitters out there in the industry. Michael, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
All right. So what made you decide to become an engineer?
Yeah, good question. I have the kind of typical story, which is growing up being a tinkerer, wanting to break things, see how things were built. So I kind of had a natural curiosity for these things. And so, but funny story, I actually thought that, even though I loved, kind of doing all of those, all of those things, I thought that maybe I'd get into psychology, going into college.
Interesting.
Cause I had
what made you think that?
Yeah. I don't know. I just kind of, for whatever reason had this affinity for kind of how the mind works and, was kind of very interested in that. And I started kind of exploring that a little bit more. And then I realized, probably, in fact, my parents highly, highly discouraged me from even pursuing that. Finally, my parents convinced me to, stick with kind of my other passion, which was engineering. But I think it's actually helped me that kind of natural curiosity for how the mind works, has kind of helped me in my career, especially as a manager and leader.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask the same thing. How do you think it has helped you, especially in your leadership roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, at least for me, some of the same kind of engineering principles apply for kind of how the mind works and how we all feel different things and why we feel different things. And so it's helped me kind of just, break down methodically, what is this person dealing with? What are the challenges? If I were this person, how would I be acting, or how would I approach this, and trying to kind of get inside their mind, have some empathy. It's helped me kind of dive in and figure out how to best guide somebody, or how to work with them to get to, whatever the goal is.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you've worked for some of the largest and really most prestigious and influential companies out there in the world. How did you get hired at those companies? Was this like a very methodical, intentional approach that you took, or did you just kind of land in one and then that led to the next, which led to the next?
Yeah, it's kind of changed a lot from company to company, but I started my career in the aerospace industry. So I was working on heads-up displays for military planes, F-18s and F-22s. And, I think I spent 2 years working on a project. And I think after I left 8 years later, it still hadn't been released. And so,
wow.
It was a very slow process. I learned a lot. It was really, really exciting in that sense. I mean, just absorbing so many aspects of, kind of the trade-offs of designing something like that in that kind of environment, from, structural to thermal to, kind of, whatever it might be, vibration considerations, things like that. And optics was a big one. So, but it was just too slow for me. And I felt like, I wanted to, number one, be in a faster pace environment, but also I wanted to be working on something that was closer to the user. I can't really put myself in the shoes of a fighter pilot necessarily. So, even though it was really, even though it was really cool stuff to work on, So I really was intentional about wanting to make the switch to Apple. At that time, the iPhone was not yet released. I think it was just getting released. So it was still kind of earlier on. And, but I loved the products. I was always a consumer, and I was like, my dream was to find a way to work there. And so I reached out to basically everybody I knew, friends of friends. And I tried, my best to get my foot in the door there. And I was able to get my foot in the door, at least to kind of talk with the hiring manager. And from there, it was a series of, 15, 18 plus interviews, because I was interviewing with I was interviewing with 3 different teams. I was interviewing with the iPod team, the desktop team, and the portables team. And there's this famous Apple design challenge that you have to go through as well. So I had to do that kind of in my spare time and present that. And, so it was a lot of just kind of trying my best to, network and see who worked there, just to get a phone call. And then after the phone call, it was like, okay, now this is on me to really figure out how to, best present myself. And I think one of the things that I tried to focus on is, going from the aerospace industry into a Apple product design role is a little bit of a, it's a big jump in some ways. And so I tried to find the role there that was kind of most similar to what I was doing, which was a thermal engineering lead, for a product, and kind of got in that way, and then kind of moved, to product design lead and things like that. So, okay. But from there on out, it was very much people that I had worked with before, that had moved on to another company who I had worked with very closely. And that was kind of, I really firmly believe, if you're really good at what you do, and, you're a good person and you're good to work with, then, people will gravitate towards, they'll call you up when there is a challenge that they're running into, or when they see something, good opportunities coming. And it was never my goal to kind of network and, try to see what I can, what I can get or anything like that. It was more just, keep my head down, work as hard as I possibly can. And it ended up being, that these opportunities opened up at Tesla. There was somebody that I worked with closely at Apple, that went there, and I was quite interested in that company. And same thing at Google and Shaper. And, interestingly enough, I didn't know anyone that worked there. So it was just, that was kind of broke the mold there. But, yeah.
Once you earn that trust, right, it becomes a lot easier to bring you on to some new project, because person A or person B, they're not putting their necks out on the line. They know that you're going to get the job done.
Totally. And I think, I never sought out to, for that, but I think it was kind of an outcome of just, making sure that I was, doing the best job I possibly could, and that, people hopefully like to work with me, so, and then, that only gets you so far, then you have to really show up and interview. And in the Tesla days, Elon was interviewing everybody. So I had to also interview with Elon, which was a very interesting, process. So, it was early on enough. I think I was, employee, 500 something. So he was still interviewing everybody at that time. Wow.
Do you remember what kind of questions he asked you?
Yeah, it was pretty high level. And actually, funny story about that. I was supposed to interview him. It's more of a final sign off, I would say, from him. Even though he's a really brilliant guy, it wasn't technical, or, I already had those kind of interviews. And so this was kind of final sign off. And it was a Friday evening, supposed to interview him at 5:30. And, 5:30 came around. I didn't get a phone call. 6:30, 7:30. And I had my wife and my friend were over, and we were supposed to go see a movie, And so 8:30 rolls around, and I'm like, okay, well, I've waited 3 hours. I just don't think this is happening. And I tried to put myself, back in that mindset. I probably should have just canceled everything and just hang out there till midnight and just wait for the phone call, But, for whatever reason, I was like, okay, well, this isn't happening. And so we hopped in the car and we started driving, and it was raining that night. It was really, really, bad storm. So I'm driving down, and all of a sudden I get a phone call from from a LA number. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So I pick up the phone and, hello. Yeah, this is Elon Musk. And I'm like, hi. And then, so like, I literally have to start interviewing while my wife and my friend are in the car and I'm driving. I'm trying to navigate through the rain. I get off at the first on ramp or off ramp and I find like a building with cover and I get out of the car and I just, finish out the interview. And he was just asking me, why do you want to join Tesla and what questions I have for him and, what excites me and stuff like that. So it wasn't too bad, but,
what a great story.
Yeah, it was pretty funny.
I want to go back to the first phone call you had with the hiring manager at Apple, because I think it's not instructive specifically for Apple, but people listening to this, I'm sure there are those listeners out there who are trying to get a job right now, who are trying to get into this company or that company. And I think it might be useful for them to hear. Do you remember, how did you get that first call? I know you said that you kind of reached out to everyone, but do you remember any more granular details about that first call, getting the first call?
Yeah, it was actually a call. It was an email from a recruiter first. And there were some questions about kind of, my experience and what kind of positions I was looking for. So that was kind of like the first touch point where, I had to be very definitive. I tried to be very definitive. These are the three types. These are the three, roles that I'm interested in. And, this is why. So I think that was helpful because, a lot of times the recruiters, they're trying their best to, figure out, is this candidate a fit for the role that I've been assigned to? And they're not necessarily an engineer. But they see some experience and maybe some keywords and things like that. And so, I think sometimes it can be helpful to guide that conversation, and get in the head of the hiring manager. Why would the hiring manager want you? And so I think that was part of it. Just be a little bit definitive and, hey, I saw this role. This is why I think I'm the fit for it. And I'd, love the opportunity to talk with the hiring manager more about my experience. And so that was kind of the first thing.
Okay. So it wasn't like someone you had gone to school with was working there and you reached out to them and they put you in contact with the hiring manager. It was a recruiter.
It was a recruiter that, got in contact with and,
nice.
It was, that was the first check. And then I had a hiring manager screen after that. But no, definitely at Apple, it was a little more removed, right? Like I didn't have a bunch of friends that I was, working with at the aerospace industry that moved over there. So it was like literally anybody I could talk to there. And it just happened to be a recruiter. So that was the first step. And then with the hiring manager, a lot of it was just kind of listening, to what they're looking for and why they're trying to hire this position. And then just trying to play to the strengths, at least to get to the next stage where I can actually, show some of my technical, aptitude. And
apparently there were like 15 of those next stages.
It was actually a pretty intense process because, specifically it ended up being, 3 different teams that I started interviewing with and it all kind of,
so many.
Yeah, it kind of all unfolded. So, I started, interviewing with the iPod team and at that time, then it turned into iPod iPhone team. And I came in at first for just kind of like a, I don't know, maybe it was like a culture fit check. I went in just for lunch with a bunch of people, including Steve Zadeski and a few other people that were, pretty high up there. At that time they were, a little bit more junior, but, it started with a lunch. And then after that, it was a design challenge, which is pretty famous for Apple now. I mean, I think most product design roles do this, challenge. It's a battery door, design, and you have to do it on your own. And then you have to come in and present it to everybody. And, as an engineer at Apple, I then screened many people with this same design challenge. So, I got pretty good at it. But then, meeting with so many other folks, across these 3 different teams, it ended up being like 15 people, 5 or 6 people per kind of role. And then
were you working full time during all of that?
Yeah, I was working full time. Yeah,
squeeze lunch meetings or just take time off here and there, personal time so you could interview.
Yeah, exactly. And then, not to mention the design challenge, I was doing that basically nights and weekends, to try to get that done. But at the time I was so jazzed on it. I was energized by it. So I wanted to do it,
That's awesome.
I remember showing my friends, some of the designs. They're like, yeah, but that's not really what Apple would do. You got to go back to the drawing board. So it's like, so I had to start over a couple times, but, it was really fun.
That's cool. Very cool. Well, I'm going to nerd out a little bit on one of the product that you helped design, which was the Apple TV remote. And I was kind of excited to see that you had helped design that because in all honesty, I've looked at this thing several times and picked it up and studied it and been really impressed with how, integrated the whole thing is. I mean, I can't tell. I think it was machined, but I'm not 100% sure. Maybe it was extruded and then post-machined with different features. I'm not sure, but the whole thing is so smooth and just well put together that I couldn't figure out exactly what the manufacturing process was, which I think is really a pretty good hallmark of a good design. The manufacturing process just kind of fades away in the background and you're just left with the experience as a user. My wife is always making fun of me because I'll pick plastic parts up and it's pretty easy to see parting lines, and ejector pin marks and things like that. Okay, yeah, this was injected molded, but the Apple TV remote I always thought was a really cool piece of hardware. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what definitively for me, what was the manufacturing process for the housing at least? And then I'm even more interested to hear about what was the process for developing that manufacturing process, because it seems like a challenging part to make, looking at all the little intricate features that are in there.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, you are right. It is machined. It's actually extruded. The net shape is extruded. The profile is extruded.
Okay.
It is extruded. And then it's post-machined after that. And so the way I didn't really realize it at the time, but I've looked back on that project and I'm like, wow, that project was probably the most definitive, most defining, moment for me as a product designer. It was the first time I was leading a project, but I look back on that product and a lot of people mentioned the same thing, like, wow, that thing was amazing. And how it was just so seamless and it's like a ship in a bottle. And,
yeah, exactly. That's a good way to describe it.
Yeah. And it's we sold it for $19, so it was crazy. So there were a couple other incarnations of that. The first remote was that kind of the white plastic one. So this kind of came after that, and we were, developing it for, to be standalone, but also potentially in box with, kind of the first unibody MacBooks that were kind of being released. And so there's a lot of attention, a lot of interest in hogging out of billet material and undercuts and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Similarly, right after I think Remote got released, the Mac Mini, the newer, the updated version of Mac Mini, where they hogged out pretty much the whole thing out of a billet aluminum. So there's a lot. ID was very interested in this kind of no parting lines and all of that kind of stuff. And there were a couple incarnations of the remote that never made it out into the wild and different explorations that kind of led to this. But when I started getting involved in the project, there was also another product that, where the team was working on the Ipod Nano at the time, which was a hollow extrusion. Everything was assembled from either end. The button kind of came in from the outside, and then there were two plastic caps on the top and the bottom. And so there's some inspiration there. But it's well, this is a remote. It doesn't need, it doesn't need to be as complicated. How do we make it as simple as possible? And you don't really need a big board. So can we literally hog out, a circle, put a PCB in there, and then the buttons come in from the outside? It's okay, well, but then, how do we work with a coin cell battery and an IR receiver, or a transmitter and receiver? And so, we started exploring a bunch of ways to kind of create these cavities and, okay, we know where generally these buttons want to be. Like, how do we connect them? And so we started exploring a lot of the, undercuts and T-cutters that are used on the market to be able to connect those cavities. And so I became way more, experienced with T-cutters and shank to cutter ratios and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember even in CAD, catting up these T-cutters and the profiles of the cuts and everything like that just to get every last fraction of a millimeter. So that's kind of generally how it started. There was a lot of, ongoing process development. But basically we were able to kind of put a flex in the front of the board for the IR, transmitter and a really long, sheet metal contact for the battery. And we were basically able to, assemble this board in from the main opening for the buttons, basically snake it in there, seat it down properly, and then snap the buttons out from, from the outside. And that was a really one of the most challenging products I've ever worked on. I mean, it seems really simple, but getting that assembly process dialed, we had a lot of issues with the buttons, popping out during drop test, during the EVT and DVT phases. So I remember sitting in China for months, really, watching this drop tester over and over, doing all of these experiments to see how we fix it, and a lot of good lessons learned there. We ultimately fixed it, kind of in the nick of time, but, it was a pretty crazy project.
Wow. Nail biter. That's
it was
really cool. Thanks for sharing all that.
Yeah.
Another question that I have for you is, when I think of design teams at Apple, I think of these big rooms just filled with engineers and designers. And I've heard, at least for some of the projects, that's not necessarily always the case. It's smaller teams. Was that your experience, or was there just this like gigantic design team assembled?
It really depended on the product. I was working on desktop and accessories, a lot. And so the teams there were typically pretty small. I mean, like when I was working on remote, I was the only product design. I was a product design lead, but I was like leading myself.
Oh, really? It was just you?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, there were other product designers that had worked on some earlier concepts and stuff like that. But in terms of kind of, taking it from where it was into mass production and executing on it, was me. And then after I left, they did another version of that same remote, but the buttons were slightly proud. They had like a bump to them, a puff to them. And so there was a kind of a second, version 1.5 that was released that some other folks worked on. So I can't take credit for everything, but yeah, at least that, executing on that one, it was myself. And it's where I learned the most. I mean, I didn't, we had the industrial design team that was very much trying to treat this thing like an iPod, but we didn't have the team, of the iPod.
Yeah.
And so, they had the same level of expectations, but it was like, okay, how do we get this done? And that's why
I spent, Michael.
Yeah, that's why I spent so much time at our manufacturers in China and learned how to, create quality jigs and project manage and, got into the CNC process and all of that kind of stuff. But, at the time, the iPod teams were actually quite large. Some of the, Mac teams were pretty large. And now, if you look at iPhone, for example, I mean, the teams have to be large because, they're going so deep in each kind of module. So you'll have product design teams that are dedicated to each module. You'll have a battery product design team or a PCBA design team. I don't know exactly what they call them, but, they're really specific to the modules themselves. And they go really, really deep trying to drive every fraction of efficiency out of that. And then you have the system product design teams, which kind of take all of those modules and integrate them.
Okay.
And so those teams are quite large and I think, reflective of the scale of the product.
Yeah.
So I think it really depends on which team. When I was at Apple, the iPad team, it was before the iPad got released. But that team was growing pretty dramatically just because I think they were seeing kind of how detailed, how deep you have to go and, what the market's going to be like. And so, yeah, I think it really depends. And I was lucky to, the first project I worked on, which was Mac Pro, was a team of maybe 3 or 4 product design engineers, but a fairly large cross-functional team, probably 20 or 30 people across, different functions and electrical and, thermal and all of that kind of stuff. But the product design teams that I worked on with remote and Apple TV were really, really small. Apple TV, it was like 2 people.
Wow.
So it really, really varies. And I thought the same thing when I was there. I was like, you think there's like an army behind this.
Well, there was. His name was Michael.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Well, now you have operations armies that I think the product design, they've really been pushing the manufacturing process so much that the manufacturing process is its own product now. And so you have huge teams that really dedicated to, to the manufacturing design. And they even call it that, the manufacturing design team. So automation fixtures and inspection fixtures and how to actually assemble this at scale, with, these crazy tolerances and, gap and, offset requirements and things like that. So, it's pretty crazy.
That sounds very cool. I would love to take a look at some of the Apple fixtures. See what they can teach us.
Yeah.
Well, I'm guessing that back in that day when you were working on the, remote, you were not working 40 hours a week. This was probably a larger responsibility than that. Do you remember what kind of hours you were working, just out of curiosity?
It's a good question. It's hard to remember. I mean, I was burning the midnight oil. I mean, I was up to the wee hours of the morning pretty consistently.
Wow.
I will say this though. I think a lot of that had to do with my inexperience. It was the first time that I was a product design lead. First time I was a lead for anything. I didn't have deep experience in injection molding and CNC machining. And I was actually just like worried I was going to mess it up. And so a lot of that just came from inexperience. I was questioning my designs. I was maybe over prototyping, and so I think I was pretty inefficient in that way. I think on the flip side, I spent a lot of time in Asia, with the manufacturer, and spent tons of hours there. And that was really warranted because we didn't really have a big cross-functional team. I think it's quite different now there, but, I was really burning the midnight oil there, just really trying to, we were on a compressed schedule and, I had this kind of, anxiety that, okay, this is going to ramp into high volume and I don't want it to be like the one product at Apple that, they had to pull back or whatever, so I put a lot of pressure on myself, but I think it was a combination of, a small team being fairly, and then also really fast paced and demanding, but also my inexperience.
Yeah. Well, it shows what can be accomplished when you're willing to spend the time to figure something out. Even a young, inexperienced engineer. There's a quote I have on the wall up here at the office. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but something to the effect of, the person who's willing to spend 20 minutes on a problem is going to figure out a lot more than the person who's willing to spend, like the typical person who's willing to spend 2 minutes on the problem.
Right.
It's not necessarily the intelligence or the like innate technical capabilities of a person that leads to his or her success. It's that willingness to put the time in to figure out a hard problem, to keep banging your head against that problem until you figure it out. I think that's where a lot of really true greatness lies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being smart about kind of the information you can leverage around you. I mean, at Apple, I didn't have a big cross-functional team, but we were lucky to have a lot of other resources. I had really good bosses who had done this many times. I had, I could go, one thing I learned there was just, how to, I almost had to kind of beg people for information. And I was like, I will return the favor to you, like, hey, can you teach me about this nickel plating process? I heard you're working on it for iPod. Can you tell me about it? And then, they'd tell me about it and I would try to absorb as much information as possible. And then, when we released remote, I was like, hey, here's a couple of remotes. Thank you so much for your help, So I had to kind of barter a little bit, but,
nice.
But I think in terms of work ethic, absolutely. I certainly felt like, I'm not the smartest person in the world and I don't have as much experience as a lot of these other people, but I for sure will, I want to be the person that's kind of, in there the first and out of there the last.
Yeah.
And
Working the
put in the work
and
working the hardest to kind of compensate. And I think it developed some good muscles for me to be able to kind of take with me to other, other places.
For sure. What are one or two tools or processes that Apple uses for new product development that you think we can learn and maybe even implement into our own companies?
Yeah, good. I think it's a good question. I mean, I feel like Apple's a university in some ways. They're like the product development university. I think a lot of the consumer electronics product development that you see now in a bunch of startups and even a lot of other, larger companies like Google and Facebook, a lot of those folks, that have been developing hardware there, are ex-Apple. And so it really is kind of this, so I think the number one thing is the product development process there. Like they're the masters of it. And so, in the consumer electronics world, we followed kind of the concept to proto to EVT, engineering validation testing, DVT, design validation testing, and PVT, production validation testing. And each one of those phases has particular criteria. It sounds like, maybe too much process, but just even getting the basics right for each one of these phases kind of, the whole thing exists to be able to find issues early and dial things before they get into mass production. And so I think for me, every company I've worked at since, I've kind of taken that learning from, okay, what is EVT and what is it for? And what is a successful, basically these are all design, build, test cycles. In the very beginning of the concept, it's really maybe nebulous. And at the prototype stage, it's maybe, a prototype every couple of weeks or something like that, or, a 2-month cycle. And then maybe EVT and DVT, they get longer, 3 or 4 month cycles where you're building more units. But they're all design, build, and test cycles. And I kind of, I really have taken that to every kind of company I've gone to and tried to instill a similar process to that. And, it changes from company to company because resources change and, maybe the scale of what I'm working on changes. But, that's certainly the biggest tool that I've taken with me. It's, be very, very clear about the particular cycle that you're in. How, each phase has a reason, in the early stages, it's figuring out why and what you're building, and later on it's how are you building and how is it going to fail and how is it going to scale and all of those kinds of things. And so, that's been extremely helpful for me. I think another thing is probably, I was really spoiled at Apple because we had like a world-class machine shop. Mm-hmm. Any prototype you want, you basically fill out a ticket, you walk over, you bring some cookies, and you're like, hey guys, can you machine this for me? Or can you 3D print this for me? And it was such an amazing resource and it allowed me to, prototype things extremely quickly. Okay, there's a review tomorrow. We want to check out this snap design. Okay, let me release 3 different versions of this snap and then we can review it in person, moving at that speed. And I think now, okay, not everyone has access to a world-class machine shop, but it has become democratized a little bit. I mean, there are there's Proto Labs, there's Fictive, there's companies like this that you can leverage, even buying 3D printers at home, and so, there are these types of resources that can be leveraged. And I learned a lot about, quick, rapid iterations, and leveraging those tools, to kind of make your design decisions kind of robust early on. At a certain point, you might just have to make, a, kind of executive decision on a design direction, but at least you can be prototyping, moving very, very quickly in the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's such a huge point to the ability to prototype very quickly, just does so much add so much value to the project as a whole. I know a lot of the shops we use, they're outside machine shops typically, and so they're getting bogged down with other jobs they're doing, and we might end up waiting 2 or 3 weeks to get a part back. Sometimes we'll go to a company like Proto Labs, and they're a lot quicker typically.
Yep.
But even internal shops, places I've worked in the past where they had an internal machine shop, they would get bogged down with internal requests. And so
Absolutely.
even though they were internal, it still took, a week or 2 weeks to get a part back. I wondered, did Apple almost overstaff their machine shop so that they were really cranking parts out quickly and you weren't having to wait a week or whatever it was?
Yeah. I mean, that's why I mentioned bringing the cookies, a lot of
the
it,
front of the line.
Yeah. A lot of, and I mean, there was a very, there was a queue and all of that kind of stuff, but sometimes there were just really, really hot things that you needed to get going. Like there's a review with ID and a review with Johnny, and so it's that automatically gets you to the top, but they had to outsource a bunch of stuff as well. I think for them, a lot of the stuff that they're working on is so secretive. They go to great lengths to not let anyone know what they're working on. And so it makes sense to have it, in-house.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of other companies aren't that way. I mean, Tesla had a pretty, we were building out, a pretty large machine shop, but also, I mean, for really complicated stuff, it was just like, okay, well, or really large stuff, it's like, okay, well, it makes sense for us to go to an outside partner to get this done, and so we did that anyways. But, at that time it was like, driving down to a machine shop and evaluating them, now with like Fictive or Proto Labs, it's literally like uploading a file, showing where you want your threads and, pressing a button. And then, 8 days later it comes back from China or wherever. Cool. It's pretty crazy. So, and I guess to the point about the different phases, like I'm just really big on, why are you building this prototype? Like, what are you trying to answer out of it? And I think in the earlier stages, a lot of it's prototyping to figure out your feature set, what are you building and does this make sense? And less about kind of the, exact architecture. And that's kind of in the product definition phase, but as you move further along, it's figuring out kind of what exactly is this product and what's the architecture for it and how do we evaluate the architecture? How do we de-risk it? Maybe there's certain new technologies that go in there and how do we integrate those together? And over time, it gets kind of more and more dialed, as it gets closer to mass production. But, I think something that was unique about Apple is I think there's a lot of people that work at Apple that never really see that very, very early stage concept work, because it's really amazing how the ID and product marketing and Johnny and Steve, how they developed things, before it got to the masses of the, internally, a lot of the product definition was kind of already there. It's pretty amazing how that worked out. On Apple TV, when I got involved, and I was pretty much the first person to get involved in that, it was really already fleshed out to be kind of this small black set top, box. And not to say that no one worked on it before. I mean, there were other iterations like remote that, never shipped, that kind of led to this, but there's so many quick prototypes that the ID team did early on to like flesh out what is this thing even and why should it exist. And yeah, it was really pretty cool to see. I think I've gotten more exposure to that early stage concept work at other companies, but at Apple, they have some special sauce there that,
Well, I hope they continue to have that special sauce. I'll take a real short break here and share with the listeners that teampipeline.us is where you can learn more about how we help medical device and other product engineering or manufacturing teams develop turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines to characterize, inspect, assemble, manufacture, and perform verification testing on your devices. We're speaking with Michael Kubba today, and you also worked at Tesla and Google, and I thought maybe we'll spend a few minutes talking about those places as well. Starting off, I guess, with Tesla, what were a few of the best and worst things about working there?
Yeah, I worked at Tesla during a really unique 2 years. I was only there for 2 years, but like during that time, we went public. We kicked off the Model S, and when I left, we were like 6 months or 4 months away from production start. So all the architecture was done and all of that kind of stuff, and a lot of the validation was done. So it was a pretty cool time. We moved into a new headquarters there in Deer Creek in Palo Alto. At first we were in San Carlos. So it was a unique 2 years. I feel like it was more like equivalent of like, 4 or 5 years. But for me, it was one of the best jobs I've ever had. I really loved the vision, and I really appreciated, Elon's laser focus. That really resonated with me. I think one of the things that I liked the most about it is how vertically integrated everything was. So, the design team sat upstairs. On the second floor was our production lines. And then, on the floor below was the production lines. And then the floor below that was our test labs. And, so it was like every day I'd be, upstairs designing stuff, and whether it's, mechanical design, or I'm doing some, CFD, fluids, evaluation. And then I would, go down and test it out in the lab, and maybe put thermocouples on this, power electronics module, or you take it to the dyno and test it out there. And then you go upstairs and you're managing a pilot production run. It was just so cool to me. And, then this part doesn't fit. Okay. Like, let me run over to the machine shop. And it was like very, and I think they did that for a reason. It's like, let's bring, Elon's really a proponent of vertical integration, and it started with kind of having all these capabilities under one roof. And that was kind of a highlight for me. I learned so much in that process, and I loved being involved in all of those aspects, testing and project managing the manufacturing build and design engineering. And it was just so versatile. It was early on enough where, you could jump into all of these different roles and, full ownership across, the whole thing. I really appreciated that. Lowlights, I really don't know that there were too many lowlights for me. I mean, it was a very difficult 2 years, it was a lot of stress. But, I can only say good things about my time there. I don't know, I've had friends that have stayed there for 12 or, 15 years, and that I don't know that I could do that. I think it's, kudos to them. And I think they've really figured it out, and the company has changed, but it's a fairly intense environment, and right. That's not why I left. But it is, it's very mission focused, which means that like everybody's all in all the time. And I think they've kind of had these like, existential crises over and over again. They're finally getting to this point where kind of they're sitting on top of the world, but it's still a lot of work. So,
how do you get to a point, do you think, where everyone is all in all of the time? I mean, that's a really difficult ideal to set, and well, maybe it's not so difficult to set. Difficult to facilitate, maybe.
Yeah.
How do you think they did that?
Yeah, I've tried to replicate this at like every other company I've gone to, and it's hard. I don't know that there's an exact formula, but I do think one aspect of it is like, being super clear with the mission or the vision of what you're doing. And it's like, sometimes it's so simple, but like Elon kept saying, we're not trying to build the best electric car in the world. We're trying to build the best car in the world. Like even in my exit interview, he told me that. So like he just said it over and over and over again, and like, to the point where it became like truth. Like that is what we're doing. So like and it's super simple, but like, let's remind ourselves, like, what is the mission here? And it could be, in that case, it was pretty audacious, but, once you started building some momentum, people are like, oh yeah, I think we can do this. Yeah.
How else did he make that mission so clear? I mean, he said it, but he's not talking with every employee every day. Were there banners up? Were there emails getting sent out? Were there memos being passed around? How did that message get communicated frequently enough and clearly enough so that everyone bought in?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of repetition. I mean, he was quite involved. I mean, we had many reviews with him, very detailed technical reviews. Huh. He was very hands-on, very involved. And so it was repetition. It was emails about hey, this is what the priority is for the company. Everybody needs to be, all in on this thing. And this is why, and he was kind of honest about the threats that existed, and why we should do something. So he was, very clear about that. So I think it was repetition of the mission, very, very strong prioritization communicated through all of the management layers, and, through email, direct email, through conversations. And so it kind of built this culture that, he even says stuff like, if you're not needed in a meeting, just walk out of the meeting. And that's all in the spirit of being really efficient and prioritize, and not getting, bloated as an organization. And so yeah. I think those things really helped. At least for me, I try to emulate that, being clear about what the mission is and being very vocal and not being scared if it sounds too simple,
Yeah. Well, let's move on to Google. And what projects can you share from your time working at Google? What was one of the hardest projects you did there, or most interesting, and any stories in particular that come to mind, maybe lessons learned from your time there at Google?
Yeah. I was there for about 5 years. I started at the time, they had just started Google X, which is now X. But it was kind of this skunk works, work with Sergey, kind of lured me away from Tesla at the time. And it was about 80 people at the time. I think it's probably a few thousand now. I don't know. But, and at that time, there were a bunch of different projects going on but the one that I was mainly working on was Google Glass. So I didn't know what I was going to be working on until I joined, but it was like this, oh, you're going to work with Sergey. It's going to be a new kind of consumer device that no one's, seen before. And so about half of the Google X team was working on Glass. And then there was a bunch of other projects going on, like Loon, which is another project that was going on. And then I was also supporting kind of on the side, this project that was disclosed a few years back, for glucose monitoring in a contact lens. So I was kind of just doing a little bit on the side for that, which was kind of interesting. But I was mainly working on Google Glass. I worked on kind of the first version of Google Glass, which was kind of off the wall and crazy. We then started working on a second version. And then, Tony Fadell, ended up, through the Nest acquisition, taking over our team, or kind of being the executive sponsor for our team. And through that, we started working on a bunch of different wearable products and things like that. Many of them didn't ship, but we started kind of pivoting after that and focusing Glass on kind of B2B as opposed to a direct to consumer device, which kind of, there's a lot to say about, the failings of Google Glass, but there's some cool technology in there for sure. I mean, at Google, it was quintessential, technology being at the forefront and trying to lead the product development. There was no clear use case defined. There was no, problem necessarily that we were trying to solve other than, a meta level problem, which everyone's trying to solve now, which is, technology is in your way. A screen is in your way all the time, right? So how do we get technology out of your way and make it transparent and get people looking in the eyes, looking in each other's eyes again? So I can buy into that. And I think every company is working on AR glasses now. You can see Google just released a prototype of or concept video of an updated version. And, the Meta and Ray-Ban released their version. I'm sure there's other companies working on it as well. So, for me, the process was totally different there in terms of product development. It was run more like a software company. And so this was like, I remember sitting there and kind of trying to educate the team on, my boss at the time asked me, can you put together this like slide deck of like, what does the proper product development look like?
That's cool.
So it was pretty fun, but, it was certainly, a struggle in terms of trying to figure out the why and the what, of the product. And it seemed, it's really, starting with the technology, and trying to maybe go a little bit too far in terms of form factor where people weren't ready. There were a lot of very, very difficult, technology challenges. I mean, anybody working in wearables will say that. I mean, so many challenges in terms of ergonomics and thermals and, RF and, balancing all those trade-offs. We had a very small optics projection engine in there. And, it was pretty awesome. But, why does someone want this? And how do we say it to them in one sentence why they should have this? We really struggled with that. And, I learned a lot through that, you can convince yourself in like a slide deck or in a video or something like that, something should exist. But unless you can really simplify it and tell somebody in like a sentence, you're probably not, on the right track. And, that's what, I learned a lot about kind of the what not to do in terms of product definition there.
That's a big insight. Yeah. What are some of the biggest problems that you face at work now? So right now I'm at a company called Fellow, and we build, high-end coffee gear. We are, in a bunch of retailers across the US. We have a direct-to-consumer business. We build kettles. We build, grinders, and we have a huge drinkware business. We're also getting into, a coffee business as well. And so, but at the end of the day, it is hardware. It's beautifully designed hardware. And building hardware right now is very challenging. And I think anyone in the hardware world kind of feels that. I think, not being able to travel to our contract manufacturers and troubleshoot problems real time, I really miss that. And I think our whole team misses that. Mm-hmm. We have a large team in China. And we're so lucky to have that team, and we've built that team out over the past, 2 years. But, and they work with our manufacturers directly. They work with us, and, it's a huge resource. But even still, nothing is like going on site and trying to work through, whether it be manufacturing issues or design issues, whatever it is. I think it's a huge challenge. Obviously the kind of supply chain world is a big challenge now as well. And having to really think through, even from a design perspective, what types of components are you choosing and why? Are there going to be potential shortages? How do we deal with it if we can't get this component? And so it's really like, that's come to the top of the list is, assurance of supply, and how do we remain nimble enough to be able to deal with issues as they arise? It's a challenging time to be, kind of developing hardware and ramping, but, a lot of companies are doing it. We're still doing it and doing it well. We're still thriving. So, that's really good, but it is a challenge. And then I think, it's a competitive world out there right now, and so, building a team and hiring at the pace that we need to hire, not just at this company, but at my previous company, at, even Apple is struggling with this, and there are, there's a lot of audacious goals out there. There's a lot of things to get done, but, it's a challenging time. It's a challenging time to hire. And I think people are looking for, I've talked to so many of my friends that are at Google, and I really don't want to badmouth Google. It's a great place. There's a lot of cool things that I learned there, but, within the hardware world, it can be challenging because there maybe isn't as much of a cohesive strategy,
as like say Apple or something like that. And so, a lot of people that I know, they're really frustrated. And so it's really, I think it's a good time, for people to work on the stuff that they really want to work on, that they really have a connection to. And I think that's, what I'm most excited about, at Fellow, because there is no shortage in coffee lovers. And I think that, being able to kind of meld, form and function together and really have a lot of ownership in what you're doing, it bodes well for us, and we have a good story there.
Great. Well, I've just got one more question for you. We're about running up on time here. So last question. If you could share one message on a billboard, let's say, and, millions of people, millions of engineers, this is, I stole from Tim Ferriss. If you've ever listened to his show, you may have heard him say the same thing, but we're talking specifically about engineers within the context of engineering. If you could put any message on a billboard that millions of engineers were going to see, what do you think that message would be?
That's a really good question. I think it'd probably be become an expert and move on. And I'll explain that. I'll explain that a little bit. So I think for people to be really successful, I think when I look at the people that have been most successful, most impactful for me as in my career, as engineers, it's, all engineering is cross-functional, and especially in product design, it's cross-functional. And so I think the people that are most successful are the people that can absorb complex information across multiple functions. So, it's really about like, okay, how do I learn the most I can about this thing and become an expert? I'm not going to become the world's expert or a subject matter expert in this thing forever, but I'm going to become an expert in this one thing for right now to help me do my job. And then I'm going to move on to the next thing, because there's a million other things that I need to balance in terms of trade-offs. And, I think that's been really, really impactful for me, as I've kind of tried to absorb, information to make the right level of trade-offs as an engineer, and I'm not a RF expert, but, for the time that I'm working on this project, I'm going to sit with the RF expert and learn as much as I possibly can. And, so I can talk with him in a kind of an educated way. And so I think that's, especially for younger engineers, I think that's really, really important. Become an expert and then move on and then do it again,
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, Michael, thank you so much. I sure appreciate you spending your time and sharing all of this insight and wisdom that you have won and earned through hard work over all of your years in the industry. So thank you again so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a blast.
I'm Aaron Monker, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines, and with product design, visit us at teampipeline.us. Thanks for listening.